This is not a local story. It's a national and international story, and we need to make sure that people know that. There are men willing to die for our rights. Struggle of these people, these men and women and children, led directly to middle class existence. And we can never forget that. They fought hard for us.
Some say it was a free-for-all fight. Another person said it was just like lightning. It happened very quickly. And later telegrams between the mining company officials basically said, you know, it was a fight with clubs, rocks, bricks, and guns. So very violent, very brutal.
The right to work laws, that is such a play on words that it's incredible. It's not right to work, it's right to work for less.
We demoralized our own jobs. We diminished our own worth in the communities and in what we do. Shame on us for that. You know, we told our kids, you can do better. Well, damn it, I'm doing damn good. I've got a nice home, vehicles, made a good living, raised 2 children. They've gone without nothing. They've had the best of everything, and I made sure of it. And it's because I've got a good union job that I could provide that.
Listen to the sound of the working class breaking its back. Well, the preacher's always screaming that your mansion's in the sky. That's good for the saints, but not a working guy. Stand up hand in hand for Union Town.
The voice of an immigrant miner is lost in his labor. Blacklisted, disenfranchised, he cannot speak his mind about change or rights, because language is his barrier, broken only by time. On the range, no voice is heard over the din of industry. Stripping crews rid the land of its poor burden, while men in steam shovels strip its wealth. Track gangs hammer rail, map the dirt with steel. Gopher holers, deafened to silence, drill and blast ore. Steep climbs of earth trap voices of pit gangs in walls that spiral up and out toward distant skies. A miner's life is worth less than a profit earned. At what cost do we price violence, injury, and death? Oppress them and listen, as action of one becomes the cause of many. Listen as the call for strike rises above the noise of machines. Listen as it echoes deep into the pits.
On the Iron Range in 1910 varied from place to place. For example, some of the mining locations were ramshackle affairs. They were thrown up on the edge of a mine pit. They used whatever building materials they could find, probably thinly insulated, poorly heated, miserable way to live. Then others were more organized. The U.S. Steel quickly figured out that one of the ways you can control the miners to as much of an extent as they ever could, they created organized mining communities. Some of them were company locations, eventually evolving into company towns. Crosby, for example, is commonly viewed as a company town. It really wasn't. It was independent, but the founder of the town, George Crosby, who owned some of the mines in that area, certainly influenced that town quite heavily. The elites were the veneer, and underneath there was a social world that they had no clue about. The mutual aid benefit societies, the cooperatives, the Finn halls, the Slovenian halls, the Italian halls, all of those halls.
Of course, the immigrant groups self-identified. You know, they had their own language, they had their own cultural traditions, and they would live often in their own neighborhoods. It's really like any immigrant community you know today. It was like that here. You know, when you come to the range today, people often notice there's a lot of bars. Hibbing, Virginia in particular, so many bars. Why do the little towns have so many bars? And well, they must be a bunch of drunks. And you know, there are drunks, to be sure. But the real reason there are so many bars is because you have to trace the history of the liquor license, the most indestructible thing there is, a liquor license. No one would ever want to get rid of one. Go back to the beginning, and each one of those bars spoke a different language, had a different national identity at one time. And so everybody had their own, you know, immigrant group that they associated with. But they all had this shared experience of living in this relatively geographically remote place. You know, it was considered the end of the earth, I think, 100 years ago for a lot of people. And so you had this sense that we're all in this together. Certainly in the mines, you know, when miners started working together, they'd be working with men who didn't speak the same language as them. And that was by design, of course. They wanted the miners to only know enough to talk to each other about their job in front of them, if that. And they didn't want them talking about other things like pay or you know, working conditions or, God forbid, a union.
And it often took them by surprise when the workers would rebel, because they had no access to that, which is one of the reasons why they hired spies from within the workers' ranks, so that they would at least have an inside view to some extent of what was going on the range. I also think it was the work itself that united the men. The work was incredibly dangerous. The mines, especially up here in Ely and on parts of the Mesabi Iron Range, were unstable because there was a high water table. The ground wasn't bedrock. It was sandy because that's what the glaciers left behind. And so it was a very dangerous way to make a living. There were accidents all the time. It's estimated that over 200 miners died in the Ely mines during its history. The rate of death was very high on the Mesabi Iron Range. It was estimated at one point that 90% of the miners who died on the Mesabi Iron Range prior to 1920 or so were immigrant miners. They didn't understand the hazards of mining because they were unskilled. It was just a terrible system. And there was no workers' compensation if they got hurt. There was no compensation if they were killed. It was just a vicious system, and they hated it. And it was always at the core of labor disputes.
The industrial workers of the world, the IWW, or the Wobblies as they were popularly known as, it was a revolutionary labor organization founded in Chicago in 1905. the founding Congress of the IWW represented a sort of a who's who of the North American left and labor movement. The IWW welcomed into its ranks immigrant workers, women, people of color, all the groups that were, in essence, were excluded from the craft unions. So the employing class, of course, met the IWW with hostility and in many cases extreme hostility. There's famous instances such as the Bisbee deportation in 1917 when some 1,300 striking copper miners and their families were physically deported from Bisbee, Arizona in cattle cars to New Mexico in a journey that apparently took 16 hours without food or water. Other instances, there's a long list of Wobblies that were killed for engaging in labor organizing, some judicially and some by vigilantes. Joe Hill, of course, was executed by firing squad in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1915.
My will is easy to decide, for there is nothing to divide. My kin don't need to fuss, and boss doesn't cling to a rolling stone. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you. Joe Hill. This is my last and final will. Good luck to all of you.
Frank Little was lynched in Montana, in Butte, Montana, in 1917. He was dragged behind a vehicle and hung from a railway trestle.
Frank Little was a union man, a wobbly, an agitator. Frank Little fought to organize and roused with words and literature. He spoke for fellow workers from Fresno to Masaba's Range. He told them to stand up and fight against bosses and for change. Raise your fist for the one big union. Raise your fist and hold it high. Raise your fist in solidarity, for in vain Frank did not die. From Missoula to Butte, the Iron Range, Duluth, he was kidnapped, charged, abused, arrested, again and again beaten black and blue. Yet workers' rights he still attested. Frank Little was slain by lies and money, by company bosses, their glad hands and spies. Frank Little was lynched and left to become a martyr in the union's eyes. Raise your fist for the one big union. Raise your fist and hold it high. Raise your fist in solidarity, for in vain Frank did not die.
IWW locals formed quite early on as well in Minnesota. In 1910, Walter Neff arrived in Duluth. And Walter Neff, I feel, is one of the most neglected labor organizers in American working class history. Walter Neff was in one way or another associated with several very successful IWW locals. Walter Neff was also really one of the architects of the spread of the IWW in Minnesota. In 1915, Neff was involved with the creation of the AWO, the Agricultural Workers Organization. And one of the innovations that Neff introduced during that time period was the walking delegate. So locals wouldn't just have a stationary delegate where you'd have to go to a labor hall, to an IWW hall to sign up. They had workers actual rank and file workers who had delegate credentials, carried the rigging or the membership books, dues stamps, and IWW literature that would travel. So whether they were agricultural workers or whether they were loggers or whether they were miners, they would be actually on the job site, and were able to organize workers that way. So Minnesota and Duluth, northern Minnesota, became really a stronghold of these views. And with NEF, with the AWO, with the Finnish Socialist Hall, the daily IWW Finnish language press, these all contributed to a sense of a sense of workers' power, but also a real sense of possibility, a real sense that fulfilling these conditions that would allow workers to take on large-scale action and have a chance of actually of winning these fights.
We're in Aurora, Minnesota. It's 2016, and it's hard to believe that over 100 years ago, this site, the former St. James Mine, was the location of one of Minnesota's most significant and bloody labor wars. It all started in 1916 when Joe Greene, an Italian immigrant miner, laid down his tools and began the great 1916 Minnesota Iron Ore Strike.
Well, the interesting thing about the 1916 strike is that the IWW brought in organizers who spoke the various languages. And so if they were having a common meeting, there would have been somebody who was able to translate what was being said.
We're here in front of the Socialist Opera House in downtown Virginia. This iconic building had a great significance to the 1916 strike. Within these walls, there were blistering attacks against the mine bosses, plays and entertainments, as well as this serving as the beginning and sometimes ending of strike parades. Being in downtown Virginia, it was incredibly important that this served as strike headquarters. It was a center for communication, agitation, and organization.
In 1907, there was another major strike, and it was led by the Finns. And after the failure of that strike, which was led by the Western Federation of Miners and locally by the Finnish miners in particular, 7 out of 10 Finnish miners were blacklisted. But during that 1907 strike, the mining companies brought in a whole group of new unskilled miners from Eastern Europe, the South Slavs, which would have been part of what the Austro-Hungarian Empire and eventually Yugoslavia, Serbians, Slovenians, Albanians, Montenegrins, Croatians, Bosnians. All of those people were brought in to take those miners' jobs from those strikers. And by 1916, that 1907 influx, by 1916, they were quite skilled in understanding they were being exploited, and they led the strike. They were the ones who walked out.
I think that what was interesting in the gap between the 07 and 16 strike was the fact that many of these Slavic and Southern Italian miners who had been brought in as strikebreakers, in some case unknowingly, they learned firsthand that once their usefulness was over in breaking the strike, how they were really thought of. That the Montenegrins, especially in that winter after the 07 strike finished, there were articles in the newspapers about 300, 600 Montenegrins starving in Virginia. And they realized, I think, pretty rapidly that once their usefulness was over, that they were no longer important. And I think also the organization that was happening once the WFM from the 1907 strike had gone, the IWW began organizing more in earnest, and I think they began to see the similarities to what happened to the Finns after the 07 strike was now happening to them in a sense. They weren't blacklisted, but they were being treated with the same disdain. And I think they had 9 years of education, not only by labor leaders, but on the job, to understand that the conditions were much the same and that they had more to gain collectively than they had to lose as an individual people.
We're here at the corner of 7th Avenue West and 15th Street in a residential neighborhood in Virginia, Minnesota. Difficult to believe when you look at it now that this was the site where John Aller was shot June 22nd, 1916.
So the shooting of John Aller proved to be one of the most pivotal moments in the 1916 strike. And really it wasn't just an isolated incident. Things had been building up previous to this, since the strikers had all been on strike since about June 2nd, sorry. And so this incident happened on the morning of June 22nd at about 5:30 or 6 a.m. And what happened, so right now we have a recreated intersection from North Virginia, and this way up here is heading towards the Alpena mine. So about 100 strikers at about 5 in the morning, all are milling about in this intersection in hopes of stopping people from going to work and to join the strike and to, become one of them. And as they're doing this, a group of about maybe 20 or 30 mining deputies from the Oliver Company come up and essentially say, you can't be here, and really no one, eyewitness accounts vary dramatically actually on who really struck first. Obviously that's could be due to bias of who's telling the story. But what we do know is that a fight broke out amongst strikers and the mining deputies. In front of me is John Aller's house, and as all of this is going on, he essentially walks out of his house, is holding a rifle, and it would later be found out he had a revolver in his pocket as well. But so he's heading towards the crowd. Some eyewitnesses say that it looked like he had a specific target in mind, because he kept telling people to get out of the way. He doesn't want to shoot them, but just everyone needs to get out of his way. And some say that he dropped to his knee and started firing. Others say he was just walking. But the end result is that he was shot twice and he died. So he left behind a wife and 3 children. So the 26th is when they have his funeral procession, and there's a horse-drawn hearse. So the hearse that you see behind me isn't the actual hearse that was used, but it's very similar to what they had at the time in 1916. And they go through downtown Virginia. There's really a couple of excellent photos of them on Chestnut Street. So streets that people walk today, this is where about 3,000 mourners were walking to mourn the loss of John Aller. And they start at the Finnish Socialist Opera House, and they end up at Calvary Cemetery.
We're here at Calvary Cemetery in Virginia. We're at the gravesite of John Aller. He was shot off mining company property in the streets of Virginia by mining company guards. This fact did not go unnoticed by those who were organizing the strike. Aller quickly became a labor martyr. He was celebrated in the labor press, which advocated seeing his death not as an end, but as a beginning. a beginning for the IWW to refocus their energy in the strike and take things to another level. And at his funeral on June 26th, here in this cemetery, Italian immigrant organizer and anarchist Carlo Tresca called for mining company guards to pay the supreme price. In what was known as the eye for an eye speech, here delivered at Aller's graveside, Tresca condemned the violence of mining company guards and the paucity of capitalism.
Carlo Tresca was an Italian anarchist, although he was not someone that necessarily liked labels about himself. He came to this country, moved to New York City, and became affiliated with the IWW because of his radical politics, but was never actually a member of the IWW. He was too much of an individualist for that. He didn't seem to want to be a joiner of any group, and I think his politics in some ways were actually more radical than the IWW. And so he was sort of a freelance revolutionary, I think he would sort of refer to himself as. And in the case of this strike, he was doing a series of lectures and speeches in California against World War I. And he was called in by Walter Neff of the Agricultural Workers Organization to come and assist with the strike on the range.
So what I'm going through here is one folder that contains documents relating to the 1916 strike. So what we have here, part of the documentary evidence here, is Hanna Mining Company officials were talking to corporate officials outside of Minnesota. They also, as we know from the historical record, some of which is included in the folder here, they were talking to state officials. It's documented within some of these telegrams here, for example. Unbeknownst to the public, mining company officials were speaking to political officers down in St. Paul, including at one point as high up as the governor's office at that point.
We're here on the corner of Lincoln and 2nd in what used to be Hibbing. Today, it's a ghost town. In 1919, the Oliver Iron Mining Company decided that they were going to mine in the area that used to be Hibbing. So within 2 years, almost 200 buildings were moved out of what came to be known as North Hibbing. We're standing outside almost the front door of the Hibbing Finnish Workers Hall. We're here at another corner. This time it's a foundation corner. As you can see, these rocks mortared together were the foundation of the Finnish Workers Hall, built by Finnish immigrants in 1909. This hall was a symbolic representation of the agitation that led to the 1916 strike. And it was from places like this hall, which take us back 100 years ago, and I'm standing in the corner of the hall. From this hall there were plays, lectures, parade meetings, all set up that led the resistance to mining company control during the 1916 strike. Strikers were taking it to the streets. Oftentimes, these conflicts would turn violent. such as the case with John Aller in the streets of Virginia, or at the Masanovich boarding house in Biwabik.
So Tom Lodvala was a pop wagon salesman for the Nimi Lodvala Bottling Works that was out of Biwabik, Minnesota. And essentially, him and his partner were selling pop in the Chicago location that day. That's when the deputies come to the Masanoviches and are there to arrest Philip Masanovich. So as they're inside, Tom comes outside from the neighbor's house and then goes over to Philip's house to sell pop to them. However, when he gets up to the front door, he peers inside, and obviously it's a little bit more than he bargained for, because inside, you can just imagine, obviously there's a fight going on. Tom obviously probably tries to back up and leave, but then the fight erupts out on the lawn. So he's essentially amidst this giant skirmish between strikers and the deputies. It was said that the strikers essentially wrestled guns away, but eyewitness accounts on that are even fuzzy because most people who were there only saw Nick Dillon with the gun, and they only saw Nick Dillon shooting. But essentially, at the end of it, Tom Lodvala is shot and killed, and one of the eyewitnesses said that he died on some other guy's fence. So in the aftermath of the Biwabik shootout, 4 strikers are arrested, put on a train, and sent to Duluth. On lines 3 through 6 on this arrest ledger from the city of Virginia, essentially those are the 4 strikers that were arrested during the Biwabik shootout. And on the offense, you'll notice it says held for sheriff, and then on the other side, on say why discharged, it said taken to Duluth. But they're not the only ones in that train. Deputies would break into the hotel rooms of several strike leaders as they were staying at the Fay Hotel in Virginia. And this occurred roughly at around 3 or so in the morning. We have basically a story from Carlo Tresca explaining what he was doing that day, and then it eventually ends with him being arrested for first-degree murder, even though he was nowhere near the incident that happened in Biwabik.
We were being accused of a murder that took place in our absence in a different town. We were being attached artificially to the murder case in order to eliminate us from the strike picture. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning when we finally landed in the Duluth jail, and I could tell myself that one day of my life had been completed. 'Twas a crowded day indeed. And that morning when they found themselves in Duluth was the 4th of July, 1916. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was born in Concord, New Hampshire, and moved to New York City when she was, I think, around 10. And her parents are the people that sort of converted her to socialism. And she joined the IWW in 1907, first came to the Iron Range in December of 1907 to give a speech, and at that time she was only 16 years old. So she was sort of this, someone referred to as the East Side Joan of Arc. So she was this sort of young, fiery Irish girl. And she came to the range in December of 1907 and met an organizer named Jack Jones, who was an Iron Range miner and labor organizer, and fell in love and actually married this Iron Range miner. So her connection to the range became that much stronger. And the marriage didn't last very long. I think someone described as that she fell in love with the miners of the West and married the first one she met. And so that marriage didn't work very well, and so she ended up going then to assist with IWW work in Washington and elsewhere on the West Coast.
And there are women of many distinctions in this cruel world, as everyone knows. Some are living in the finest of mansions and are wearing the finest of clothes. They're the blue-blooded queens and princesses who have charms made of diamonds and pearls. But the only thoroughbred lady is a rebel girl. Oh, she's a rebel girl.
Flynn and Tresca had been in a relationship for several years before the strike, and it was discovered in 1913, I believe, when Tresca was, I believe, punched in the stomach at an event, and a book of poetry fell out of his pocket, and it was addressed to him from Elizabeth and had notes and little underlinings in it. But it meant that when Tresca was arrested in the 1916 strike on July 3rd, or early hours of July 4th, it meant that the stakes were that much higher for Elizabeth. And what was at stake was not just him being in prison, but he was being charged as an accessory after the fact of murder, which in Minnesota at that time could carry a life imprisonment. Flynn and Eder tried to keep the strike going, they tried to keep morale up, and at the same time tried to lead the defense fund and the defense efforts for Tresca and the other organizers. And they had to do it fighting their own organization. Bill Haywood, who was the president of the IWW, was not forthcoming when it came to assistance, and he seemed to be more interested in the propaganda value of these organizers and miners in prison than in getting them freed. They stayed in prison for several months until in December the prosecution realized they didn't have much of a case because these organizers themselves were miles away, had nothing directly to do with the crime, that they weren't going to be able to secure a conviction, and so they offered them a bargain with the idea that the organizers themselves would be released, along with one of the Montenegrin miners and a Montenegrin miner's wife who was involved in the scuffle. In exchange for that, 3 of the miners would have to go to prison. They would be sentenced from, I believe it was 2 to 5 years, but they were told they would serve 1 year only. The judge who guaranteed they would only spend a year left in the interim. Another judge came in and threw the book at them and said 5 to 20 years in prison. The 3 ended up serving a little over 3 years in prison before they were eventually released. And it was at that time that Carlo Tresca essentially cut ties with the IWW. He was very frustrated with the support or lack thereof from Bill Haywood, and I think it had his fill of the organization. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn stayed in the IWW but began to steer clear of Haywood because she also disagreed with what he had done. And Joe Eder, the other organizer who was called in to assist with the strike, also left the IWW at that time.
We have a photographic collection here of industrial workers of the world, what we have described as a surveillance collection of photographs. In terms of what that volume of photographs constitutes, the first several pages are an index itemizing or naming individuals who are in the photographs throughout the volume of photographs. So the photographs that constitute this photographic album, to the best that we're able to date them, and there is some intrinsic evidence that allows us to do this, at least on some specific photographs, dates from August 1916 up through early October of 1916. And as such, that really bridges the space between really the very end days of the summer strike for the iron miners up on the Mesabi and dovetails into eventually in early 1917 the lumberjack strike.
We're here among the towering pines of the Lost 40. The Lost 40 is probably one of northern Minnesota's most unique natural areas. Due to a surveyor's error in the late 1800s, the Lost 40 was left untouched by the logger's axe. It is, however, illustrative of the type of area that we would have seen in 1917 when Minnesota's timber beasts took to the woods to harvest the area's natural resources. Logging camps would have been tucked away among giant towering trees such as this. And it is from these logging camps that the timber beasts exited the woods en masse to start the 1917 strike.
Living conditions, especially before labor organization became more widespread in the logging camps, was fairly primitive. The bunkhouses, which in bigger camps might sleep up to about 200 men in bunk beds, you would have straw for mats, very primitive bedding, very minimal washing conditions.
It mattered what type of camp it was and how long a lumberjack stayed there or how long he worked there. Particularly important to a lumberjack was the cook. If they had a good cook in the camp, the lumberjack was more inclined to stay there and eat. After all, that was one of the few pleasures he had. Most of the time he was busy working. Cleanliness was another part of it, and some of the camps were so bad that the men would not stay there for any extended period of time. And last night I was reading in the newspaper that about the mobility of the lumberjacks. Very few of them stayed in the same camp the whole winter. And according to the article I was reading, one of the companies said that in the course of the winter they had hired 7,700 lumberjacks, but that any one time they only had from 75 to 80 who actually were working in the camp. So that's a good indication of how mobile they were and how quickly they were to spend a couple of weeks one place and decide that maybe things were better somewhere else.
So you can imagine in the winter, 200 men going into a bunkhouse, putting their clothes up to dry by the stove. You know, the smell would have just been powerful. Typical logging camp, Sundays the workers would boil up their clothes, and in the lingo of the time they would read their shirts, and by reading their shirts, what they meant was looking at them for lice. The work itself could be quite dangerous. Felling a tree, you know, after it comes down, it's really there's really not much you can do. It's gravity that's taking control. The log could split in half. It could spring back on you. Tom Scribner, he joined the union in 1914 in a logging camp outside of Cloquet, Minnesota, and he tells a story of a log rolling over him. And as he says, his intestines came out his back end, and the doctor had to stuff his insides back into him. So these are some of the dangers. Felling trees, the river drive, of course, very dangerous. Floating on a sea of logs, you know, going down a river, going down rapids. Trying to dislodge a log jam on a river, of course, was very dangerous work. Oftentimes, if the log jam was serious enough, it would actually have to be they'd have to use dynamite to dislodge the log jam.
I think the lumber camps were located all around the Bemidji area, but primarily, from what I've read in the newspapers, I think they were located more of them were located north of Bemidji than any other direction. And that was partly because of accessibility, and the camps were, many of the men used the railroad going north up towards Big Falls and Gemmel and Margie and that area to get to and from the camps.
Friction stirs in the north woods. Agitate the beast, and he will rise tall as pine, shake his limbs free of the 12-hour day, release grip on his cross-cut saw, throw down his axe, and fight the boss's law. Shouts of timber cease. Whistle punks fail to steam. There is no danger in silence. Trees harbor no ill against idle hands. Sawyers and jacks know more than brawn. They know wage measures more than change. They know a fist can hold firm to more than axe handles. They know the language of labor speaks many tongues, but theirs is a single voice composed of 1,000 tracks crunching through snow. 1,000 tracks that speak one action, one revolution. 1,000 tracks that blaze the path from the woods to Gemmel Station.
On this winter day, we're walking along the former railroad line that used to connect International Falls and Bemidji. The little whistle stop of Gemmel was the epicenter of the 1917 strike, because in this little hamlet there existed a depot, and it was at this small depot that the hundreds, if not thousands, of timber beasts were streaming out of the woods almost 100 years ago. So in essence, Gemmel and its little depot was kind of a filter place for all of the timber beasts heading out of the woods. Some went west to Bemidji, many went to International Falls, and some even headed back down to the range cities.
Okay, the IWW Hall here in Bemidji had difficulty finding a place that would accept them, of course. I mean, the average businessman didn't certainly want to sponsor having the IWW offices in their building. So they had to find somebody that would accept them, and they established their offices in what was called the Dickinson Hotel on 2nd Street. 2nd Street was, and the block that they chose, was really Bemidji's red light district.
Well, the strikers were not looked on with very much pleasure. And the businessmen, of course, in town didn't want higher wages. So they were willing to run people out of town on a rail if they were supporting the IWW.
That the people who, for example, ran the saloons down here on the 2nd Street area were sympathetic to the strikers, because the police actually went in and warned them about their sympathies for the strikers. The OK Restaurant was one of them, and that was run at one time by Dutch Mary Thompson, who was known throughout northern Minnesota as a madam, and was fined many times here in Bemidji and died in Coochin County in a fire. But she was running a restaurant, and her restaurant was specifically mentioned in the paper as one of the places that they stopped and warned the proprietors that they were watching them. I think during World War I, the boys had no idea what they were getting into. They had never heard of that type of warfare. And so Bemidji became ultra patriotic. Many people were eager to sign up. There were some that were considered slackers, and of course the newspaper was very harsh with anyone that they named or identified as a slacker. But I think generally the boys saw this as a chance to leave Bemidji, a chance for adventure. I don't think anyone had any idea what war was really about.
Well, Mr. Vandersloot was very much in favor of supporting the Army and the Navy and whatever, and whenever there was to be a big parade for those going off to war, he wanted all the businesses to fly their flag.
He campaigned to clean up this town. He wanted those people out of town. He was very patriotic. He demanded that people express their patriotism in lots of different ways in town during the war. And in that case, he became sort of the enemy of anyone who was socialist or had socialist ideas. And I think as a leader, that was his message was, I need to clean this town up and I'm going to do it.
And Mr. Kaplan, who owned a grocery store here in Bemidji, and he was very much in support of the workers. He did not have his flag flying. And Mr. Vandersloot got together a group of men to come down and pound on the door and ask why he wasn't flying his flag. Fortunately, his wife answered the door, and she said that yes, they did have a flag, but it hadn't come yet. They, of course, did not believe that, and so Mr. Kaplan had to produce the order that he had sent for the flag. But this was very harmful to Mrs. Kaplan. She did not come back to Bemidji. She left Bemidji. She was very upset with the feelings of the people here.
In addition to the federal government crackdown on the IWW in the United States, the trial of 166 members, several states also passed criminal syndicalist laws, Minnesota being one of them. The laws were expressed quite vaguely, as a matter of fact, but they were directed explicitly at destroying IWW influence.
Yeah, Jess Dunning was the secretary of the local IWW headquarters, and the IWW prided themselves on not having leaders, but he was seen as a leader because of that position. And as a result, after the Crookston Mill fire, when they rounded up the IWW members and deported them, and then also tried to charge them with the fire, which of course they eventually did not go ahead with. They couldn't find any evidence to charge them. They did find a couple of books they found unsavory. One of them was Sabotage by Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and they put Jesse up on trial for distributing those two books at the IWW headquarters because he was seen as the leader, as the secretary. And he was convicted and did 2 years for those two books. I think what's most significant about the Jess Dunning trial is one, that the state of Minnesota passed a bill and then named it after the IWW, right? Like, you know, you're in big trouble when they pass legislation and name it after you. And it was used to target the IWW and other folks who were doing organizing. And Jess was the first conviction under that, which was the precursor to the Espionage Act nationwide, which is still something that's used to squash dissent to this day. But a lot of other people followed in his footsteps to prison or were exiled from this country. Yeah, another interesting article, or actually two articles that I found in the Bemidji Pioneer from that same time were about the deportations, and these happened at the same time as the Jess Dunning trial was going on. They rounded up all the folks at the IWW headquarters at gunpoint, marched them to the train station, and sent them out of town. And they actually called it a parade, which is really not the appropriate word for people being sent out of town at gunpoint. And of course, the IWW came right back to town
and then they were again rounded up, marched out of town at gunpoint. And those deportations they weren't significant in that it was anything out of the ordinary. This was happening all over the country.
No work, it's all melting down, boy, 'cause the bankers done took that away. They're probably working on Wall Street this morning, but there's no work at the sawmill today. It all trickles down, that's what Reagan said. It seems like it's trickled away.
But the history of this building goes back to my father and grandfather as well. The building that we're sitting in was actually a theater at one time. Not the type that you think of as with film. It was an actual live theater. And it was purchased by our union, I believe it was 1959. It's had its ups and its downs. There's been times where financial issues were threatening, but we've always persevered.
But for me, it makes me feel like I'm at home when I come in here. I've got a lot of memories already in here through all the meetings. And then maybe it's coming to the union Christmas parties or whatever. But yeah, it's just like if I went home. I love the unions. And it's nice to have a building right on Main Street that I know I can go there and visit with fellow union employees, brothers and sisters.
This hall itself has seen many family reunions. We've had weddings. I got married in this hall. My sister got married in this hall. My parents had a reception in this hall. We've had funerals in this hall. It is a gathering place, not only for unions, but for working families, whether they're union or non-union. There's been benefits. I can't tell you how many countless benefits we've had in this hall. There's been tears shed, there's been bloodshed in this hall.
Union busting is a dirty business. It raises havoc in communities, drains local residents of their hard-earned dollars, and often results in violence and unrest. I'm Nat Benchley, and this is the story of workers joining together to fight BE&K, the largest non-union construction company in the paper industry. For years, BE&K, a leader in the anti-union Associated Builders and Contractors Association, and a favored strikebreaker for companies throughout the nation, has prospered at the expense of workers and communities.
B&K specialty is strike busting.
Our main objective and target at this time is BE&K, a strike-breaking organization who has been successful in the past few years in breaking strikes, manning jobs, and keeping mills producing without loss of much time or sometimes no time in various parts of the country, and putting all of the local people outside of the gate looking in and disrupting the communities, and eventually they die.
That was a big deal for us. I know the expansion here, we weren't involved in that as far as union and the paper mill and stuff. However, there are a lot of things going on around town, and so as a union steward, I was there to protect them if I heard they were running into trouble at the bars or whatever, because she got pretty wild around this town. Here's what was going on. There were employees for contractors that came in from out of state, you know, whether it was Arkansas or Alabama or whatever, and a lot of the contractors were non-union. So they had built a man camp out west here, and they'd actually bust those guys in to do work during the expansion. And what happened out of that was you had some tough feelings going on throughout the city with union employees, and then these guys that came in to do work in the expansion. And so things got a little rough, like out at the bars or in the parking lots, or maybe even in the grocery stores, words, you know, and stuff. And so they were here to help expand. Boise was putting money into fixing up the paper mill, and this is a strong union town, and it caused a little rift, or quite a bit of rift. So. You know, people don't understand what a union's all about, and we try to educate them, and we try to inoculate them into what a union household is about. And by household, I mean where you work. Because let's face it, you spend as much time with the people you work with than you do with your own family at home. And part of it is the union contract. The union contract, you live by this, you die by this. The rules are in this, the benefits are in it, your pay, everything. There's an old saying that density is your destiny. And it's true. I mean, it's the same letters, it's just put in a different word, but it's true. The stronger the density in a town, a community, is good. The stronger the density in an industry is good. And that's really what we preach and try to get people to understand, that in order to make your job better, everybody needs to be organized.
You know, this hall, it means so much to so many people. Again, we've had the countless benefits for people that are down and out. And people come together, break bread, give money, donate prizes, donate their time. It just goes without saying, thanks for all you do. I'm pretty sure my father is proud of me. I'm pretty sure my grandfather's proud of me. I know my uncle's proud of me. So it means a lot. Drive by this hall and see your dad's name on the front of it. Pretty good feeling. Big shoes to fill, but I think he'd be okay.
Blurred are the lines of war, of peace, of sorrow, tears of joy. Good work and bad action, repeated by different hands. Peace of mind in peaceful work, forge the weapons for another, bullets cast and equipment they put into action. You worry if your sweat, if your strength and your skill, if work is enough, because it is maternal joy, and we are lucky children. Isn't it so that you forget about it somewhere in a daydream? Cold sense, clear sense. I speak of being forged in fire. In the current year, the world will be restored. The history we create is not the foundation. Enlightenment is the only cornerstone, and we must trust in progress. The road is long, burdensome, harsh, slow, so they say, and many hard workers grow weary and hopeless on their way. But that does not change the means to find it. The road to vendetta is twisted. The iron law is tested. To be young with time, onward, rushing forward, to give.
I think the strikers would have liked the legacy to be the sense that we fight. We fight when we feel oppressed as workers, when we feel that jobs aren't fair, that companies aren't fair, that we would fight. That was certainly the message of the IWW, and certainly was adopted by many of the miners who were striking for bare economic reasons, that the pay system was unfair, and that they were working so hard for so little. The legacy today is that, well, today the mines are good jobs, as I said before, but we still have people working their butts off on the Iron Range and not making much money. They're not in the mines. They're elsewhere. And so one of my questions as a writer is does that ever make a leap? Will people ever make the leap to the idea that their grandfather or great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather fought back when they faced the conditions they now face at their gas station job or their light manufacturing job? Will they make that leap? Right now, I don't see that happening. There's such a separation, and we forget what the real legacy of the miners were. When we see mining politics today, the way politics and mining intersect in our state, there's this idea of hard work of miners, this nostalgia for what miners did then and what they built for us today. And that nostalgia has kind of a smothering effect on the fact that the miners then weren't fighting for the mines. They weren't fighting for the ore. They were fighting for their lives and their livelihoods, and particularly their children, and what world they would have.
I've had one gentleman, a friend of mine that I just was with at a conference. His name is Jay Merrill. He's from a local, machinist local up in the upper UP of Michigan, you know, and he showed me what he does when he meets a new employee. He has this contract and he asks him what his dominant hand is. And if the gentleman says, well, I'm right-handed, he gives him the contract in that hand. He says, okay, now what do you have in your right hand? He says, I have my contract. He says, what do you have in your left hand? Nothing. He says, that's what you're going to have if you don't have that contract. Just remember that.
I used to have a list up on my bulletin board in my electric shop as a union steward, so all the men in the garage and fellow public works department could come in there, and I'd point out all the different things that the union has built for them. Because every once in a while you get somebody that'd say, what do they do for me? Well, you know what? I had a list a mile long of what they did for me.
I don't think today's generation has that history of how we've evolved to where they have the wages and the benefits and the protections that they have today. It was because those folks had spilt their blood in the streets back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. It's never over. Negotiations are never over. The fight and the struggle for your benefits and the things that will affect your living, how you raise your children, where you home yourself, the kind of vehicle you own, the clothes you put on your back. Every single bit of that is part of negotiations. And it's a struggle for the future, and it will continue. We do not want to have a society without unions where you have the rich and you have the poor, the haves or the have-nots. You know, and unfortunately, it seems like within the United States of America, we have to go full circle in order to learn a lesson. And it's like, why do we have to do that? Why can't we have learned from our past and grow into the future? Why does our future always have to bring us back to our past?
We meet today in freedom's cause and raise our voices high. Join our hands in union strong to battle or to die. And hold the fort, for we are coming. Union workers, be strong. And side by side we'll battle onward and victory shall come. And look, my comrades, see the union banners waving high. Reinforcements now appearing, victory is nigh. And hold the fort, for we are coming. Union workers, be strong. And side by side we'll battle onward and victory shall come. And see our numbers now increasing, hear those bugles blow. And by our union we shall triumph over every foe. And hold the fort, for we are coming. Union workers, be strong. Side by side we'll battle onward and victory shall come. Fierce and long the battle rages, but we will not fear. Help will come whenever needed. Cheer, my comrades, cheer. And hold the fort, for we are coming.